Huh? Oh. Yeah, you can. Oh. Hi guys, we're about to start the presentation. Welcome to the Brickworks New York Design Studio. My name is Anna Luanzanis, and I'm the Design Studio Manager here. Whether you're joining in person or virtually, I would like to invite you to our first event of 2022. At Brickworks, our goal is to make beautiful, stylish products that last forever. Products that are innovative, modern, timeless, and durable, as you can see on the display. The studio represents the very best of Brickworks and is a demonstration of our ongoing commitment to the architectural, building, and consumer communities. Our guest speakers here tonight are Paul Anderson and Paul Preisner, whom, amongst their many prestigious projects, were the commissioners and curators of the Pavilion of the United States at the 17th International Architecture Exhibition at the Venice Biennale. I would like you to give them both a warm welcome to our studio and thank you guys for braving the cold and speaking to us here tonight about the execution of the US Pavilion at the Venice Biennale. Before we begin, there's just some small housekeeping. The fire exits are on your left and the bathrooms too on your left. Please welcome the Pauls.
Hi, thank you for coming. I'm Paul Preisner. This is Paul Anderson.
Hi.
I think, before we get started, one thing that we want to do is thank Brickworks as one of our sponsors for the US Pavilion. We both literally and metaphorically couldn't have done it without their enthusiasm and kind of support of the project. So that's what we want to kind of show you about, is the Pavilion of the United States at the 17th International Architecture Biennale. This is the US Pavilion. Usually I kind of start with a little bit of a history. So the Venice Biennale was a biannual art exhibition, art fair that began in the latter part of the 19th century. It was kind of constructed within the public gardens, the Giardini, and slowly expanded. In the very first part of the 20th century, nations started producing and building their own permanent structures to house their art within the gardens. The Belgium Pavilion was the very first one. The United States started or kind of constructed their pavilion in the 1930s. The New York Grand Central Art Galleries commissioned the project, operated the project by New York architects Delano and Aldrich, and it was constructed. Here it is. We'll kind of get into it a little bit later as our project kind of relates to it. In 1980, the Biennale introduced the architecture exhibition to take place in the off years of the art exhibition that happened. This is the 17th occurrence of it that we put on last year. Here's the kind of generalized title. Our project was called American Framing. And I think it is both a metaphor in a sense and quite literal in that it's literally wood framing. Paul and I have been working together on projects, collaborative projects since 2014. When was the first?
13. Yeah.
13?
Yeah.
When we put together a project called Two Barns for the Biennales of America in Denver. We had since more or less every year done these kind of collaborative projects. We both maintain our separate independent architecture offices. Paul's in Denver, mine in Chicago. But every year we had worked on one or two of these kind of collaborative projects for exhibitions, whether it was the Chicago Architecture Biennale, the Biennale of Americas, or kind of open competitions for projects. And we had started to notice a theme of our collaborative work where we seemed to kind of identify one particular material type or kind of construction type and explore it or kind of exacerbate its qualities and produce a kind of weird thing, whether it was a steel vault that was so thin its building permit drawings were represented by a single line that caused the plan reviewers problems, or a big stack of foam bricks in Denver. And the cycle of the US Pavilion application was coming up, and we were just trying to figure out what we might work on next. And we both at the time had, in our own practices, single-family houses that we were working on under construction, kind of in the skeletal frame of wood framing, which you see everywhere and generally never really think about except in passing. And we were talking and thought that it might seem a kind of half-smart idea to make a proposition for the US Pavilion at Venice to kind of really investigate this type of construction that's so ubiquitous, it's more or less invisible or disregarded or kind of unheralded, but underscores and maybe kind of supports the kind of generalized American landscapes of building. Paul thought that was a smart idea. And so we kind of did, and we started looking into it for a kind of full year with workshops or seminars that we ran at the University of Illinois in Chicago, where we both teach. And the history of it is kind of as follows in an abridged sense. So it is a form of construction out of softwood, which is a very kind of terrible form of wood for these types of things. The trees grow fast, it splinters, it's a little like irregular, it warps. It originated in the Midwest, Chicago, Minnesota, Michigan, largely from immigrants of Europe, Scandinavia, that were coming from traditions that were familiar with these kind of half-timbering structures or full timber structures. But at the same time, we're in this kind of new world that was rapidly expanding population-wise, both with need and with land as it moved west, but also didn't really have full access to the kind of supply of hardwood that produced timber structures, nor was there really the kind of prevalence of skilled labor that would be required to do the kind of heavy timber construction with lots of mortise joints and kind of carving and things like that. But cheap wood was in abundance, and low-skilled labor was in abundance, and a kind of like feral creativity that started to realize that you could produce things without columns as long as you had 20 columns of much lesser construction. So you get basically the stud wall, which is kind of in between masonry and hardwood in the sense in that you've distributed the load to all of these rather poor forms of construction, and it somehow kind of works. With minimal details, with wood that's light enough, you can kind of carry it to the site yourself, or you can put it on carts as your family runs west into Nebraska to put a stake on some land, with the requirement that you build a house there to acquire ownership of it as westward expansion kind of happened. You could build it with low teams. You could build it with your family. You only needed a few kind of marginal details to become familiar with. And you could start to produce an architecture that typically, at the time, this is again the early 19th century, the 1820s, 1830s, the majority of architecture was either masonry, stone, or heavy timber at the time, requiring heavy equipment, lots of horses you might not own, and people who knew what they were doing to work with those things. What the Midwest also had was Douglas fir and lots of kind of spruce and softwood, so it was kind of easy to get, and it built a city. For example, Chicago, this is the South Lumberyard on the South Chicago River. This is a photograph from early 20th century in Seattle. I think it's a Time Life photograph just showing kind of the loose lumber stacked up there, producing its kind of own architectural object by all of the kind of minimal parts of the project itself. There's a human. This is also the lumber works or the kind of lumber yards in Chicago along the river. Wood has a downside. It also, does this. And Chicago also built itself and unbuilt itself by its kind of use with soft wood in a sense. But it kind of began to expand because it was so easy to work with in a sense, because it required such little investment in education of the workers, because you could kind of do it yourself in a way with with a familiarity with some basic concepts. It also became something that was used for carnival novelties. This is the Coney Island elephant, which was an actual elephant that was made that you could kind of go up into. There's awful histories of it, the kind of slaughter of black union workers in the Bogusa sawmills. People moving stuff with trucks. But again, the basic premise of it, and I guess in a way the promise and why it became so adopted, is it was cheap, it was quite simple. You could just kind of put people into it. They didn't need to know much more than how to swing a hammer. And you didn't even need to be precise with nails, because nails were cheap and you would just use a lot of them. So these are the trees that built America, the Douglas fir. And wood frame construction, at this point in history, starts to account for over 90% of all of the domestic structures in the US. And that's still the case. Sometimes per year as high as 96, 97%, but always over 90% of new construction in the US is softwood framed. One of the reasons that this was made possible was the production of cheap nails. As before, the kind of nails were hand forged. It took a while to make, but mass-produced nails produced the assembly system that allowed you to cheaply put together wood frame studs. As things developed, they got even cheaper and found ways to make use of even worse parts of the wood. So most of the wood gets subsumed into dimensional lumber. But then the remnants of that now get used into OSB, which provides the kind of sheathing that keeps the things up. So one thing about wood framing that is kind of, let's say, visually unsettling is that everything looks like a mess until it's all done, and no wall holds up by itself, but it requires all of them to be put together before there's any kind of structural stability. So the overview of the construction has tons of diagonal bracing, temporary supports. Once every wall's up, it's still not really laterally sound until it has the sheathing on it to keep it together. None of the parts are very good by themselves. When they're all kind of together, they produce a reliable house. There's a kind of interesting anecdote that Paul discovered early on, I think was in Indiana. There was a house that got lifted off of its foundations during a windstorm, a wood-framed house. But it just rolled down the hill intact in ways to kind of like, which settled some nerves, I guess, in a sense. Here's the pattern drawing for OSB, measuring of trees. And that will just bring us to the kind of particulars of the project. So this is the Giardini in Venice, which is the site of the US Pavilion. The Giardini is the big public gardens, which is populated by other national pavilions, the British, the French, Russian. The US Pavilion is located right there. Here we go.
So, one of the reasons, like Paul said, that we thought that this might be a good topic to present at the Venice Biennale, which really has people from all over the world coming to present different kinds of ideas and projects of architecture, is that, like he said, it accounts for over 90% of construction in the US, but in other countries, it's not used very much at all. I mean, most countries have a little bit of it, but it's for sure not the primary way of building. So a lot of people outside of the United States haven't seen it. And even people in the US maybe have seen it here and there when they drive past a construction site, but maybe haven't actually walked through a building while it's being framed or something like that. So what we did, so these are some of the models that we put together for the proposal. And what we wanted to do was build a full-scale framed structure that was uncovered to show what framing looks like and feels like to visitors to the exhibition. So we proposed this, and I'll get into a little bit more of the specific design of it in a minute. But it was, to go in front of the pavilion, you would see the original pavilion building, which is a neoclassical building through it, and and enter the exhibition through it. So then this is it as construction was being completed. You can see here. And in many ways, it looks like a house. We anticipated that it would be somewhat familiar to people. They might recognize that it has a roof, that it has dormers, that then it has an eave in front, which you can see at the bottom of this image. And it creates a kind of screen through which you see the neoclassical construction of the 1930s pavilion building beyond. In a way, this was important because the contrast between the two, because the neoclassical building had aspirations toward European architecture, to try to bring the best of a Beaux-Arts tradition of design to the United States, whereas the wood frame construction is really a very, very different kind of thing that's more workaday and ordinary, not especially considered to be exceptional in any respect, but it's just kind of the common material of construction today. And so we thought that contrast was an important one to make. Well, at the same time, we designed it as an addition to the original building in the sense that it finishes off the normally open courtyard, so that courtyard is actually an enclosed space. Visitors entered the exhibition here through the wood frame structure and could go up into the upper floors of it. And again, it was intended to look pretty much like a house with a porch and eaves, but maybe in an odd version of a house too, in the sense that it was very tall and skinny. There were more dormers than you usually see, and of course it's unfinished. And in going up and through this built full-scale version of it, people would be introduced to the subject without us having to explain what wood framing is. So you just go there, you walk through it, you get a feel for it, you start to understand what it's like, and through that experience, you know what it is before you enter the galleries where you'd see some other work on framing. So here you can see about how it was 4 stories tall and only about 12 feet deep. 12 feet, the slab actually, I think was a little more than 12 feet. The actual building was a little under 3 meters. So. And this is the Scandinavian Pavilion on the right, and there were, some things when you build things, you don't even think about them or anticipate them, and then you start to see certain correspondences once it's there, and there's kind of fun, interesting coincidences. And one of them was this here, that the structure of the Sverre Fenn Pavilion next door is the rhythm of that just kind of carried across into the framing. There were 2 sets of furniture. So everything on the exterior of the exhibition, so that was in front and in the courtyard, was built full scale, and everything on the inside is not. So outside there were 2 different sets of furniture that were designed by colleagues of ours in Chicago. Carrie Norman and Thomas Kelly designed this furniture, which you'll see a few different pieces. This is the rocking chair version of it, and it was shaker furniture that then was built out of just kind of regular dimensional lumber. So, but it changed. They couldn't make it exactly the same because you can't cut a piece of softwood and a curve. So the rocking chair can't rock. It just has a piece that just holds it steady. And actually, a lot of really one of the more beautiful moments I think that we remember from the early days of the pavilion was one of which was a mother sitting in the rocking chair with her baby, just sitting there quietly, on the front porch of a house. It was really nice. So this is the rocking chair again. Then they made another just basic kind of a kitchen, sort of like table chair, and then there was a bench. And then and those were located throughout this full-scale wood structure as a kind of domestic furniture, which made it feel a little more like a house. And they were positioned on all the floors so people could sit and look out over the Giardini from there. And then moving from that into the galleries, there were several sets of works that were presented in the gallery. So on the walls were photographs. There are four, really four rooms with like a kind of rotunda in the middle in the building. One side, two of the galleries we presented work by Chris Strong, who is a commercial photographer who took very like kind of straight documentary photos of construction sites and people who work in wood framing. And then we had on tables running through the galleries models. They're all at the same scale, half-inch scale models of buildings which maybe were important in one way or another to the history of wood framing. So we kind of tell that history through models, running through the show. And then on the other side was some work by an artist named Daniel Shea. And we'll show you, some examples of all of that stuff coming up. But here you can kind of see, like, this was a typical setup for a gallery room to have some models in the middle and, photographs on the walls. This is the first gallery, and it starts like, similar to the approach to the whole exhibition. We start with the most familiar, recognizable sort of images and examples of wood framing, and as you go through, they become less recognizable and a little bit more abstract or ethereal or nebulous in terms of like, maybe you don't understand exactly what they are. And that was intentional because this is something that wood framing, I think architects, we think we know what it is and how it works, but I think the one point of the exhibition was to try to open that up and ask whether or not there are some newer, different ways that we could think about it and use it. So, it was intentional for it to go from like what we know to maybe we don't know this as well as we think we do, and we can, find some new understandings or interpretations of it. So these two models, the one on the left they're both kit homes basically. The one on the left was a 19th century one that was published as Cheap Farmhouse was the name of it. And it came with plans and a list of materials, so if somebody was going out on the prairie, they could use that to build their home. And on the right is a Sears catalog home from the 19-teens. And then, just a few more examples of that kind of stuff. And then this is just a few glimpses of Daniel Shea's work, which, do you want to talk about that?
Keep going.
Keep going. So Daniel's work Daniel's is an artist, and his work, he documented materials and textures and people and animals that are adjacent to wood framing, but not strictly speaking wood framing. So it would be, like here, for example, you could see like the bark of a tree, somebody who's working on a construction site. You'll see other examples where it'll be just like the leaf patterns, or like a bird in the forest. He visited the places where forests where the wood comes from to build this way. Places where the wood framing is and things are going on, but like tried to understand like how, what are all the kind of like pieces of culture and nature that are connected to and kind of create the mythology around wood framing. And at times, like the presentation of that could be like that photos hung very high. In some cases, like the photos were different sizes. This is a group of models that another set of models that were a little bit more examples of kind of alternative architecture, I guess you could say, and for sure like more exuberant formally. So on this one is on the right is a dome from Drop City, which was a countercultural artist community from Southwest Colorado that was from like 67 to 72 roughly. The one in the middle is a blockhouse, which is this like military outpost that they built on the frontier. It was a building type that lasted a few decades and then was gone. They rotated the upper floor so they could see better, survey the land around it better, but it also has a dark history like a lot of the rest of wood framing, in that it was, those were like military buildings that were used in the American Indian Wars. And this is a warehouse, which may or may not have been, probably wasn't the first wood-framed building, but Siegfried Gideon, the historian, in was it Mechanization Takes Command? Or
think
Space-Time and Architecture, I'm sorry. Space-Time and Architecture, he attributes like George Washington Snow, the guy who built this warehouse, he says that he was the inventor of wood framing, although then in a footnote, he goes right back and retracts that and says, well, he probably wasn't, because this was probably a more organic, anonymous kind of invention that took place slowly over time in a grassroots way, where people were kind of making little improvements here and there to it, and he inherited that from them. But this is the first documented individual building, at least that we could find, where the first time anybody says, like, this building was wood framed and it's important for that reason. And it was built on the Chicago River in 1832. And we worked with, I think this is actually really important to know that we worked with students from UIC on all of this, particularly on the history and the models. So they actually researched all of this and tried, and then figured out, like, which ones do we need to make in order to present this history. And they did all this, like, forensic research to reconstruct this one. We don't know what it looked like. No photos or drawings of it exist. But knowing its use, which it was a lumber storage facility, and knowing what the building site was, and seeing that located on a map, we could they were able to kind of, like, and knowing, like, the construction detailing of the time, how pieces went together, they were able to reconstruct it and say, like, this is probably what it looked like, but again, with no evidence other than a bit of disputable oral history, it's possible that this building never existed. It's just some more shots of the galleries. Here's some more models. The ones on the left were refugee cottages that were built after the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco. And they're actually starter homes. People could, they paid a small amount of rent, and then after 2 years, they moved them off of the site. I think they paid $2 a month or something like that in rent, and then after 2 years, they would move them off the site to some other place in the city, and a handful of them are still in San Francisco. And on the right, you see mobile home, and mobile homes were made of wood framing too, And in addition to the history of, like, the individual examples, if somebody was, like, really into this stuff, you could go through the exhibition and look at how the pieces were assembled too. So, I don't know how many of you, like, know the background of wood framing, but originally it was called balloon framing, and now we do platform framing, and it's, for various reasons, it's a lot better. But the way that, say a floor joist, a piece that holds up the floor, and a stud and a wall come together and are connected, that's changed over time, and was actually done accurately in the models. And here you kind of see through several galleries.
Yeah, I think no. So just kind of continuing through, I think, like Paul was saying, the way that the interiors were organized was basically this continuous thread of models, which allows you to track the history. And those models are not necessarily canonical projects, but just generically representative projects of particular moments. And then they were aligned with a set of photographic works, either by Christopher Strong or Daniel Shea, so that you could kind of get the communication of these things. Here's some details of some of the models. This is the cheap farmhouse by Solon Robinson. It was a project not necessarily or explicitly built as a single thing, but it was actually offered up as a kind of set of instructions, a list of materials that he had published in the American Agriculturalist in the time he was an Indiana businessman. It was a house that was developed in parts so that the family could begin with the kind of initial small home that had the hearth where they could cook, and then as they got more money or needed more space, they could continue to kind of advance the home and build new things. It was published with a set of kind of basic plans that kind of looked like this and identified, like, where you start, then rooms B and C, and then the two wings, and then basically an itemized list of everything you needed. 72 2x4s at 6 foot long, 132 2x4s at 12 feet long, 48,000 nails, things like that. Like basically all the parts that you could need, somewhat an early precursor of the Sears house, which then also just sold you those things too. Whereas as the Robinson house was kind of a description of the parts, and then Sears, as what their business was, also sold you the parts for the kit home. Here's a detail of the refugee housing from the San Francisco earthquake. What these do as you're kind of walking through the exhibition is to kind of highlight both the technical history, as Paul mentioned, where you can see the early models constructed as balloon frame projects, the later models as platform frame projects, but it also allows you to see the kind of typological breadth that wood framing had within the kind of American cultural landscape, that it was used as a kind of domestic structure, but an emergency structure as well, a kind of functional structure that you see with the warehouse, a kind of menacing structure that you see with the blockhouse, the kind of military fortress, a kind of optimistic, utopic structure that you can see with the kind of weird geodesic dome, which was built by hippies who didn't fully understand geodesic dome theory, but kind of got it, and used a set of parts that also just included scrap materials for sheathing. So I think like the range of like formal domesticity to kind of informal refugee housing to kind of formalized structures of violence to these kind of utopic spaces gives you the full range, and then you kind of end with the one that is kind of a ghost in the sense, and might or might not ever have existed in a sense. Our students were able to kind of locate where it existed. And then we even included as the bridge a small doghouse, built at the same scale as every other model. This is Spike's doghouse. This is Spike. So Spike is a famous cartoon character from the Tom and Jerry cartoons. He is continually harassed by the cat and mouse. It actually, when Spike is in there, it's the only motivation that Tom and Jerry ever had to kind of be friends. The rest of the time, Tom and Jerry were always fighting. But this was Spike's house, and it was his kind of place of peace, and where he had, and we kind of have this, and we were able to actually find a set of blueprints for the house, so the model was constructed accurately to the original intention. Why does there's human hands, not dog paws, on this slide?
He had weird like hand paws. Yeah,
hand paws. But it's in here in a way because I think one of the things that fascinated us early on about American framing as a type, for different reasons, is the kind of ubiquity of it, where it's so common and prevalent that it goes unnoticed. It's kind of unthought of. It's certainly not considered special in any way. There's nothing rarefied about it. It's rather dumb. It doesn't require an enormous amount of skill to begin entry-level work in it. So you can make your own doghouses. And I think what is wonderful about that level of ubiquity is it's when something develops a kind of non-specialized identity that allows it to start to become subsumed in the rest of culture, and in our sense, American culture, where framing started to take the place of a kind of narrative role in other creative works, whether it's cartoons, whether it is the tract housing that Elliot and his friends ride their BMX bikes to kind of try and get ET away from the feds when they go through this like development in Southern California, or whether it's the kind of instruments of terror that exists as the tools of construction in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre mythology. I forget this artist. This is.
Give me a second.
We also forget. Yeah. But whether it starts to become something that is even just identified by conceptual artists as a way to further explore dimensional structure, kind of humans' relationship with objects, or kind of cartography. These are these kind of thin frames of the artist did, or whether it's used as a kind of like mode of entertainment. This is Jim Duggan, who had the nickname Hacksaw, that was a professional wrestler in the late 80s and 90s, and his kind of instrument was just a 2x4, right? Like it developed a kind of like universality within American culture that you immediately understood as it a kind of working man trope. right? A kind of like blue collar thing to familiarize yourself with. Like unlike steel or unlike concrete or unlike any other form of construction, it was something that was for everyone, right? Kind of for anyone and for everyone. There are these kind of artistic studies that are just done of forestry principles that you can kind of see. It, again, was used in comic books as a way to kind of address structure, both in a literal sense, in a kind of graphic design sense. This is Gasoline Alley. This is a strip from 1932, 31, 32. And this is just a framed house in construction, but they're kind of using it split among all of the cells or frames of the comic strip as a way to kind of, as these two characters are even understanding the kind of metaphysical idea of an individual identity, or kind of how a personality is framed, whether it's the kind of study that was done of the kind of gay culture or human figure by Toms of Finland when he came to Southern California and kind of saw logging culture as a kind of expression of what year was this from? I don't know, it was volume 10, 16, volume 16. I don't know the exact year of this one, but it was this kind of magazine that he illustrated the covers for. It was after he came to the US, so the 70s or something? I don't know.
70s. I thought it might be.
No. It's used as just kind of props and stage sets for the musical Oklahoma, or kind of understood as a narrative device in Dorothy, or in The Wizard of Oz. She caught Toto by the ear. But it was, important enough to identify the house, within there. The house was small for the lumber to build it, had to be carried by wagons. And this is the kind of view looking back from Spike's doghouse to, again, just see like these things related to each other. And these are, the next ones are kind of some examples of the two photographic works or the details. So the first is by Christopher Strong. Again, he's a photographer within Chicago. He does a lot of documentary work for musicians or artists or corporations or kind of corporate clients or institutions with portraits. And he was kind of tasked with giving us, I guess, a visual location for the construction site to kind of show how feral it is at the time, with the kind of temporary bracing where nothing is really holding itself up until all of it's holding itself up. The kind of irregularity of a seemingly regular system that you have to accommodate difference with wall types. Just the kind of notions of the sites during their construction, the suburban development in Southern California with a house in construction next to the houses already completed. Rebuilds from the fire. But he also kind of looked at the social aspects of labor in particular senses, the different categories of labor. He spent some time with an Amish pre-engineered wood-framed fabrication facility in Indiana and hung out with them to see their factory, to see the products of their factory. The kind of full scale of construction labor is identified, the kind of like generalized labor, the Amish labor, the kind of more precarious classes of labor that exist in the United States that account for an untold amount, but say 250 to 350,000 undocumented or kind of lightly documented day laborers that work for like $20 a week and build a lot of the American landscape. The kind of life of that, the kind of home builder just doing repairs. To kind of give you the full spectrum that one might have, and also a kind of union class of labor. And then Daniel Shea, whose work was more mysterious or kind of mythical and kind of exploring the origin myths of wood framing by kind of looking at the forest that could kind of be everywhere and in fact are everywhere, the kind of wood itself, the kind of details of it, the kind of fauna that exist around it, and the kind of denied view that one might get, or the tools, or the kind of details of construction, or the social aspects of labor as it might happen. This is just a kind of full elevation, and I'll let you put it in the garage.
Okay. So, as as we mentioned earlier, like when you approach the pavilion, the permanent pavilion building is behind the full-scale construction that we added. So it's a backdrop to it. When you come out of the galleries, that relationship is reversed, and the backside of the structure that we built is a pretty abstract, flat, wood-framed wall against which you see the neoclassical building by Delano and Aldrich. So it reverses that, and then at the same time, presents wood framing as something that is a little bit less familiar and a little bit more abstract. And so, in addition, then there's the second set of furniture. I mentioned the first one were the pieces that were more domestic and kind of were in the structure to make it feel a lot like a house. And then there are a series of 4 benches that were in the courtyard designed by Anya Jaworska, and they are more like public furniture that is in something that's more like a plaza or a piazza now, with the structure, with the wood structure closing it off. And yeah, people used them a lot, actually. It was a nice place. It was pretty quiet. It was nice to have somewhere to sit down, because when people visit the Biennale, it's like a ton of walking around and looking at stuff. And so to have some place that was a little bit shady and cool and quiet and had a nice place to rest for a minute was, I think, appreciated. And each of her benches is detailed a little bit differently. The tops are a little different, like this one in the foreground scalloped, obviously, and the one in the background, if you can see, it has just a very subtle, kind of like valley in the middle of it. This is the 4 of them, and again, here you can see how that really tall and sheer framed wall it starts from this side to be the background to the building, and even the tree in the courtyard. Questions? Yeah. Oh, you just say, oh, well, thank you. Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we both do.
Both of us do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you do any art projects aside from design?
Yeah, I mean, I think we both maintain our individual practices. Paul's in Denver, mine here, or mine in Chicago. And through that, we've both done either institutional work. Paul's did a dormitory. We've done commercial or retail work. So we
Sure, yeah, of course. And off and on we do, like some of the projects we do are like, just buildings, like kind of straight buildings in that way. But then, we often, both of us, often either independently or together, will do projects for biennials or projects where we collaborate with artists to do a proposal of some kind for an exhibition or for a gallery or, things like that. So yeah, in to go in it?
No. I mean, I think one thing that, I mean, in terms of how we've approached our collaborative work for exhibitions, they've usually been actual scaled things in a sense. I mean, architecture exhibitions and biennales, I think, has a very young history. In a sense, the first museum department was the Art Institute of Chicago's Department of Architecture, which is only maybe 45 years of age. Art as an exhibition has history dating back much further, and therefore is already a kind of more matured and sophisticated.
Oh yeah, for
thing.
sure, it's doable. Yeah. No, I mean, we like doing full-scale work, and for exhibitions in particular. I think it's, we both we've been doing that for a while now. I think we both really believe in that as a way to show architecture. Yeah, for sure. We haven't, so we've done a whole, like Paul has mentioned, a series of projects that are full scale. None of them are a house per se until, I guess, this one, which is outside, not inside, but you could do it inside. No, in fact, there are 2 follow-ups to this exhibition. One is going to be in Prague this summer, and all the models and photos just went there. There's another one, though, that we're just starting to work on in Chicago for Wrightwood, and we haven't finalized anything yet for that, but we, something full scale will be built inside there. So that would be, I don't know if probably won't be a house, but it'll be something that you could
Just for future
walk
reference.
through. Yeah, no, totally.
I really enjoyed your talk. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. You guys want to know anything else? Want to know anything about cartoons or?
I thought the mouse was and sometimes they go after the cat. I was wrong about that?
So sometimes, so here's like in the main episode with Spike, the one where he tries to build his doghouse, what happens is Tom keeps chasing Jerry, and somehow Jerry will run through what Spike has started to build without disturbing it, but then when Tom comes through, he has some kind of problem, and he will destroy what Spike started to build, which then makes Spike mad, and then he beats up Tom. So, and this just regrettably happens over and over again, so that Spike keeps trying to build his house, it keeps getting destroyed. He takes it out on Tom until eventually, I can't remember what he does, but he does something like to Tom where Tom can't even get to it, and so then he finally finishes his house and is happy.
I think the mouse and Spike had teamed up at some point in a few episodes, but the existence of Spike was the only thing that ever unified Tom and Jerry in episodes. Made them like give up their cat and mouse differences, I guess, to be mad at a different type of animal. I don't know.
Yeah.
We can answer any questions, but if not, we can also say thanks very much, or even see if you just want to see a different image than this one. All right. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks to Brickworks for having us here.
Yes. Thank you.